Hello, and welcome to the Ruby Rogues. I'm John Epperson, and today on our panel, we have Dan Bromer.
Hello.
And Valentino Stoll.
Hey there.
And today, for a guest, we have Jorge Manrubia. I apologize if I butchered your last name.
No, that's perfect. Hello, everyone.
Hello. And Jorge, would you mind just take a minute and tell us a little bit about why you might be famous, why people might know you a little bit?
Sure. So, I'm a Rails developer. I currently work at BaseCamp in the security infrastructure performance team, where I'm a lead programmer. And so we work mostly on infrastructure projects, BaseCamp. We don't do product stuff. And before that, I have like a bunch of years of experience working first with Rails and before Rails with Java. So, that's me.
Awesome.
Did you work your tail off to get that senior developer gig just to realize that senior dev doesn't actually mean dream job? I've been there too. My first senior developer job was at a place where all of our triumphs were the bosses and all the failures were ours. The second one was a great place to continue to learn and grow, only for it to go under due to poor management. And now I get job offers from great places to work all the time. Not only that, but the last job interview I actually sat in was a discussion about how much my podcast had helped the people interviewing me. If you're looking for a way to get into your dream job, then join our Dev Heroes Accelerator. Not only will we help you get the kind of exposure that makes you attractive to your dream employer, but you'll be able to ask them for top dollar as well. Check it out at devheroesaccelerator.com.
Well, welcome. And we kind of brought you in today because we wanted to do some talking about encryption. You've written about it and had a lot of things to say. So I guess maybe let's kick it off. So can you tell us a little bit about, you wrote an article about Rails encryption. Can you just maybe kind of get us into this? What's in Rails encryption? What's our story here?
Sure. So we at some point the last year we contributed a feature to Active Record in Rails to encrypt active record models attributes, and this feature originated in Hey. So just to put the story in context, when I joined BaseCamp in 2019. In that time, I joined by the end of 2019, and the company was focused on this new product, Hey, which was codenamed Haystack back in the day. And this all started for me when I was in the first meetup in Chicago, in the headquarters, the former headquarters of BaseCamp. And I remember that in some internal presentation, David was making the point of that we had to raise the bar when it comes to privacy in Hey. And he shared this question from his wife about whether his employees were going to be able to access their emails, which is a pretty legit question. And I remember, in that time, we didn't even have a clear idea of what we were going to do. This privacy project had many legs. Encryption was only one important part of it, but it was clear to us early on that we needed some kind of system to protect information access when you were using Rails consoles. Because Rails consoles are a very powerful tool that everyone uses, and it was clear to all that it was clear to us that it wasn't acceptable that anyone could open a console and access customer emails, other colleagues' emails. At the same time, again, for example, imagine the case where you are checking your application logs. Would you like to see email chunks when you are seeing updates or inserts in the database? Is that acceptable? So all those things were concerns we had. So we started this project to analyze privacy from many angles. And when it comes to, since Hey is a MySQL-powered application, database encryption was a very important part of all this privacy initiative. And I started working on that. We had this loose idea of some kind of framework for encrypting data, the active record level model, and I started analyzing other libraries and got something moving after some time of research and study. So that's how it originated. And we created this. Well, we created several versions internally, and finally we released. When Hey entered into the public beta phase, we shipped our first encryption version internally, and eventually, 1 year later, we contributed it to Rails, and now it's going to be an official Rails 7 feature. So that's the story of more or less of how it went.
Nice. So there's two angles here that I think are super interesting. One is encryption of attributes or whatever in Rails itself, which I definitely wanted to talk about that versus the adder encrypted gem. But then obviously the console thing, which I think is completely new. I don't know of anything that even lives in that space. So
Yeah,
let's go there
those are the
first.
two legs. Sure.
So the first thing that I noticed about the console, and is maybe a less serious question, but I think it's kind of important. I presume that console 1984 is a reference to the grand old book 1984.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it tries to be like a humoristic reference to the Big Brother novel, so that when you are using
Yep.
the console, you are not on your own. You have like someone observing what you do. So it kind of tries to evoke that, but in a kind of funny way, not serious or dystopian way.
Nice. So my understanding of, well, maybe I should just have you talk about the basic understanding of the console. Like, so what is the basic thing that it does?
Sure. So yeah, first let me say that when we talk about why encrypting information, there are like two sides or two reasons. One is that because it's an addition security layer for your application. So imagine that someone gained access to the database or to a snapshot of your database. So if the information is encrypted, it's like another barrier against accessing sensitive information. But a very specific scenario we had in mind was controlling access to sensitive information internally inside the organization. So, what Console 1984 does is it extends IRB, the Ruby console that the Rails console extends itself, and it extends IRB to make sure that when you, well, it does several things, but most notably, when you access information that is encrypted with active record encryption, it's not going to reveal the clear text. It's going to show the ciphertext. So you can't effectively access to encrypted data. And that's one thing.
Okay, good.
And it also records the commands you enter so that someone can audit them later. And it also prevents accessing external systems. So, for example, imagine that you run a Elasticsearch instance or a Redis instance, anything that is TCP based under the hood. The console 1984 is going to intercept those low-level connections and make sure you can't hit certain URLs or IPs that are protected, so that you can, for example, use Elasticsearch to access again emails in our case. So, and then it has like, because we know that the console is, we wanted to keep the console functional, and sometimes you need to decrypt information to access it. So, for example, in Hey, if we run into some kind of incident where email got stuck for, I don't know, some encoding issue or something. I mean, it doesn't, it's a silly example because this doesn't happen, but imagine that due to some incident that is causing some big trouble, we had to decrypt. That's a justification for us for decrypting. Or imagine that some customer is having problems with certain email, and in order to troubleshoot the problem, we need to access the email's content. So in that case, we always ask for permission to the customer for explicit consent for accessing that email. And then in the console, you can say, okay, I'm going to decrypt. And the console is going to ask you, what is your reason for entering to this unprotected mode? And then you can, well, normally you can paste a link to the consent by the customer. In our case, we always like require a link so that this is the justification, and the console is going to, well, show you the data. Then it's going to record that reason, and eventually in the case of BaseCamp, there is a team that every 2 weeks performs an audit of all these accesses and check the commands entered, the reasons, and check that everything is justified. So yeah, console 1984 does all that. And there is like a sibling tool which is audit 1984, which is a Rails engine that lets you check all these commands and perform these audits. It's very simple, but it's the one we use, and it's also something that we shipped not so long ago. So yeah.
Nice. I definitely, if this had existed about 4 or 5 years ago, I was working on a project where we totally could have used this, but that's okay. So one of the things that I was thinking about as you went through that, one of the problems that I encountered at this project was, I mean, I can just in my console type rails.config.whatever and get my configuration out, right? And I have it, depending on where I've placed my key, right? I can get my encryption key out, and then I can go and manually run some commands to decrypt some stuff, right? So if I were a malicious developer, I can do things that give me access to the data anyway. Does Console 1984 handle some of these edge cases, or they're just, I mean, the console is a pretty powerful tool. I'm not necessarily certain that it's plausible to catch all possible edge cases, right? Like I could, if I logged into my server, for example, I could just cat out my key and get it that way. So there's a lot of different things that I can do.
Yeah.
Does it handle some of these edge cases? Yes or no?
I mean, you could do literally almost, you could literally do just about almost anything, right? So yeah, maybe just a quick addition to that is, does it use a whitelisting approach to say these are the specific things you can do, or are you excluding certain operations?
Yeah, so it actually, I mean, first of all, John made a great point that is, in a way, so a console is essentially a place where you evaluate Ruby code. And Ruby by design is incredibly flexible, so the language can modify itself while executing, which is a killer feature of Ruby and a feature we all love, but that makes protecting a system that evaluates Ruby code dynamically very hard. And that's true. And I guess, I mean, there are security holes now for sure, and there will be security holes here and there because it's very, very difficult to cover them all. But we've worked, I mean, the current version of Console 1984 already has like several protection mechanisms against tampering. We call this tampering, like using the console to circumvent its controls. And it goes pretty far trying to make these difficult. So it's not as simple as a allow list or deny list approach. It's more like there are like several barriers and several things we do. So for example, we pay a lot of attention to extending certain classes. So for example, imagine that you extend active record base and override save so that it doesn't save anything. And suddenly we can't record the commands anymore. So we prevent extending classes in two ways. It's internally it uses a parser, a Ruby parser, which is a gem just is called parser, and it's pretty amazing. And so we use the parser for detecting constant references, so that to make sure that you don't extend the things we don't want you to extend, we extend and monkey patch ourselves several classes to prevent the same. So that if you extend something that is forbidden, in Ruby there is a hook method, which is method added. So if you override a method in a class, the class is going to trigger that hook. And we use that hook for detecting these acts after they have happened. So in that case, you are going to get the console is going to be terminated immediately if you do that. So we do some kind of static analysis upfront. There are detection of suspicious words. I was going to say, so for example, we also override monkey patch database driver connection classes so if you try to use these classes for accessing the tables we don't want you to access, that's going to be detected. We freeze several classes too. Freezing in Ruby, I don't know if you know this, but you can freeze a class. I didn't know this, but if you freeze, so you can freeze a string and you can't modify that. You can do the same with classes. So you can freeze a class and it's not going to be, you can't add methods or override its static state. So yeah, we do many things related to decrypting things manually. If you have the key, if you get the key and you decide to decrypt things manually, I think we are currently detecting attempts to decrypt, just as suspicious words. So if you try to do that, the command is going to be recorded and flagged as suspicious. But there are probably many more things we can do. But there is, I worked quite a lot on that in recent weeks, and I think we have a good basis for the coming months. As people report more vulnerabilities, we intend to fix them and make it as robust as possible. But
yeah, that's an interesting one. Yeah. I think just because of the nature of the problem, you could probably do a PhD dissertation on showing, how you've got coverage and protection through that. But I think even in just some of the guardrails that you've mentioned, I can imagine a few others with networking and connections to database or external resources. You can eliminate 95%, probably more, right, of accidents or even malicious usage, probably, or if nothing else, audit it and flag it. I suspect that someone who is both malicious and extremely intelligent hacker-ish might be able to find something around it, but at least it would get audited.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Jorge's point too, right? Like we're trying to mitigate circumstances or mitigate the circumvention process, right? Like you can't catch every case, right? So
exactly,
catch most of them. I think this is still leaps and bounds better than just using Rails console, right? Say here, all developers just go at it, right?
Yeah, totally.
No, this is massive, right? Like it literally makes it so that you have to intentionally like work around it, which is I think what we really would want, right? In most cases, like hopefully you don't have a developer at your company that you don't trust, right? Like for the most part, we trust the developers around us. Like we give them they have a lot of power and we have to trust them. So we already have that kind of a relationship with them. So it's more about like, hey, just, let's hide information so you don't accidentally see it as you're doing work, right? Like, I feel like that's, for example, with the place that I was at, it was like the particular application it hid people's salaries. Like they didn't want people to see people's salaries. But of course, a developer who is really motivated could go see them. This would raise the bar for that, but it's not going to hide it for the super motivated person. But at that point, they're already like super far off the ranch.
Yeah, I like that reading. I agree. I mean, so when we released like this first version to the public, I had made this change to store things in the database, which was something recent. In BaseCamp, we were not doing that. So that was a recent addition that I made to make things easy to audit. And I wanted to make this very simple to install. So I didn't want to introduce like things like using a read-only database user for managing, for accessing the audits. I wanted something, a gem that you could plug and use. And some people say, oh, but this is so easy to circumvent because it was like way easier to circumvent in the first version. This is totally worthless. And my take is different. It's like, this is already a huge step forward compared to not doing anything. So the fact that it's possible to have something ill-intended or very malicious, an expert and wanting to do bad things compared to not doing anything, maybe there is some middle ground. And again, we aim to make this as secure and as anti-tampering as possible. That's definitely a goal. But yeah, I think that there is a positive outlook here, which is this is a great step forward compared to not doing anything. Instead of, since this is not bulletproof, it's useless.
No, without a doubt. Hey, I have a couple questions on, or I guess a few common objections that you might get from developers if you start a project, you're on a project and you're given a requirement to encrypt your data at rest. So a couple things that come to mind. People might think, it's going to make my application slower, right? It's going to slow down the database persistence and retrieval. And then another thing that might come to mind is, it's going to make it harder to debug what's going on, right? Because if I want to look and see, are the correct contents in my data store? It's obviously encrypted text. That's not clear text. So what are your thoughts on that, or how does the work that you've done help alleviate some of those issues that developers might be concerned about?
Sure. So yeah, the performance question is a good one. It was a concern I had, and since the first version, I wrote a bunch of performance tests to optimize things and to detect regressions. But the first thing I learned is that encryption is fast. So encryption happens in the sub-millisecond realm. So even the encryption is like one order of magnitude faster than the fastest database operation. So that means that when you are using encryption in a database-powered application, the encryption impact is minimal. Like, so if you have to decrypt, 40 fields for rendering a screen, it's negligible. You are not going to see a difference because the database is there and the database is already adding a bunch of milliseconds. Template rendering is way slower than database access, and that's, again, add a bunch of other milliseconds, and you are adding operations that are like under 1 millisecond. So it's negligible. It doesn't really have an impact when it comes to encrypt or decrypt. It's really, really fast. And regarding problems debugging, it hasn't been an issue in general because in the way it works, it's pretty transparent. So unless what you are doing has to do with, for example, encoding issues or something that is very content specific if it's something you can check with a model attribute read, it's going to be the same. It's going to be transparent for you as a developer. Now, you need to go to the database and check the actual bytes that are persisted there, then of course, you're going to decrypt that information. But in my experience, that hasn't been a blocker at all or a problem.
So let me ask you, Jorge, when you're developing, do you typically turn on the encryption in all of your environments, meaning dev, test, and of course production, or would you selectively do that?
No, yeah, we have encryption enabled in all the environments. In fact, well, that was something also that was kind of strategic, because I didn't want to develop something and suddenly enable encryption in production. You want to exercise all that encryption already while in development and while in testing. And one feature I like a lot is that it supports fixtures. So in BaseCamp, we use fixtures for everything. And if you use encryption, is transparent. So you don't really have to care about encryption. But if you create a fixture with some data that corresponds with an attribute that is encrypted, it's going to be encrypted automatically. So essentially, for developers, it's kind of transparent. Of course, we don't have console 1984 enabled in development. There is no, I mean, you can do that if you want, but there's no point in doing that. So for you, essentially, you never ever see the ciphertext unless you check the database columns directly. So it's pretty transparent, or 100% transparent, I'd say, for daily development.
Nice. Hey, on a kind of a related topic. So then this gets into search as well as one of the considerations that you have to think about. I started going through, and you have done a really nice job on the guide here. And you talk about the difference between deterministic and non-deterministic encryption and its impacts on search. You maybe want to just give the audience a quick summary of those concerns?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, the first concern when you are working with a database is how are you going to query the data, right? So with encryption, in the way we have in the system we have created in active record encryption, there are two encryption modes. One we call it deterministic, and the other one we call it non-deterministic. Non-deterministic means that every piece of information we encrypt is going to use its own and random initialization vector. Initialization vector is a parameter, an input of the symmetric algorithm we use, which is AES256. And so essentially, this is the recommended way of doing symmetric encryption, and it's the safest way of encrypting data, because this random initialization vector, well, it offers, let's say, a series of security warranties against accessing that encrypted information. Now, the problem with this is that the database, you can't query information encrypted that way, because when you are writing the query, you don't really know you can really provide the initialization vectors of all the information you're going to access. I mean, it's that wouldn't fly. So we have this. So essentially, for you to understand, if you're going to match a field in the database, you want to provide that same encrypted payload so that it matches. Okay, so if the initialization vectors are random, that's impossible to do. So then we have the deterministic encryption mode, which is the second encryption mode, where the initialization vector is not random, but is not fixed either. Is derived deterministically based on the encrypted text. And this is an important detail, because a lot of people have said, actually, I'll tell you a story. When we, in the first version of this library that we actually shipped in Hey, just before the beta, we hired a security firm to perform an audit on the library, on the code, on the approach, because there were no experts in cryptography in BaseCamp. So we really didn't trust ourselves. And a security expert, an encryption expert from this company detected this problem, because we were using fixed initialization vectors when encrypting information deterministically. And he told us, that's horrible. You can't do that. That's like not encrypting data. If you use AES in GCM mode with a fixed initialization vector, that's like not encrypting anything. And I was, oh my God. And she suggested using another standard, which is AES, but instead of in GCM mode, in SIV mode, which essentially does this. It takes, so when you're going to encrypt some information, imagine you're going to encrypt the word Jorge, it's going to derive an initialization vector from Jorge, from the payload. So that's going to be deterministic. So if you are going to query the database and want to search by the name Jorge, you can derive the initialization vector for the parameter of the query, and search is going to work essentially, or queries are going to work. And we couldn't use that standard because in OpenSSL, which is in the standard OpenSSL wrapper in Ruby, it's not implemented yet, or it wasn't implemented yet. But I tweaked the code to essentially do that. So we derive initialization vectors deterministically in this mode, and queries work.
Awesome.
Yeah, I remember I read in your in your article, which was a great post about this. I think you mentioned the fact that you had, and this is the thing, right? Pen tests, security audits, almost by definition, you need to do them towards the end, right? Because otherwise, if you pen test in the middle of your development, then you could have reintroduced a problem. You need to do a delta pen test. But I saw that you had mentioned this was, I think, 5 days before you were planning to launch the product, give or take, and so you had to make this change in a quick matter of time.
Yeah. So yeah, the change itself was very, very easy because the code was very, very. I mean, it was a line of code replacing what was it was like a 15 minutes change. But then we have the problem that all the database information was already encrypted in one way. So what happens? So when you change imagine the initialization vectors, the ciphertext, what happens with queries that they stop working? And that was like my first experience having to support encryption scheme changes, which is not easy at all. So imagine that you have for example, in Hey, we encrypt email. So when you sign up in Hey, we make sure that you can't sign up with the same email of other user, right? That's pretty basic. So what happens if something in the encryption doesn't really match? I've changed something and now my encrypted email is now different and people can sign up with your name. So those are pretty scary bugs. And yeah, probably all that area of the library where you have to support, for example, another cool thing we support is data that is encrypted and not encrypted at the same time. So that if I want to imagine that my database, half of the records are encrypted because I added encryption later when the app was already in production after a few years, and I'm in the process of encrypting everything, and some emails are encrypted, but other email addresses are encrypted. So the library support querying that way, and it's going to check both versions of the query parameter, the encrypted and the unencrypted one. So all these things were kind of challenging technically to implement, but I think also they are like pretty unique to this library compared to others. I mean, I don't know of any other encryption libraries that support these things.
So
when you first mentioned that the data could be or is both encrypted and not encrypted, at first I was thinking about the same row, and I'm like, whoa, did we just get a new quantum mechanics or something here? But then I realized you're talking about some of the content and not the other. Yeah, that was the part that I thought was very interesting because I've always thought that essentially doing zero downtime deployments introduces some really interesting challenges. And I worked at AWS for 5 years where pretty much everything had to be a zero downtime. I won't say that I miss that now. Like on my current project, there's no one using the system at night, so I can't convince anyone it's worth it to do that. But yeah, I was going to ask you how you did that. And I can imagine, you mentioned it was nerve-wracking. I can only imagine. There is a little bit, I will say, of adrenaline rush when you do, I don't know if adrenaline rush, but it is satisfying to see a deployment go out. You start it, you watch the dashboards, and when you first see those positive metrics start to come up on the graphs, it is a quite satisfying feeling. But yeah, how did you manage to pull that off? So I was guessing that one of the techniques was what you mentioned, that if you were changing from one scheme to the other, you were able to first try the old scheme. If that failed, then try the new scheme. I'm actually not even, probably my lack of knowledge about encryption, but I'm not even sure how you would know it didn't work, because wouldn't it just decrypt and give you some gobbledygook nonsense? But I don't know how a computer would know that that is not the right answer.
Yeah, no, you are spot on. So for example, at decryption time, we do that. If it tries the configure encryption schemes one after another until one works. So if you have like several encryption schemes, or for reading data, we do that. We try several encryption schemes. And for querying, we use all the configure encryption schemes to generate, instead of one value, n values for the query. So yeah, we do that way. And yeah, it was. So the first time we shipped this, it was really nerve wracking for me. But what I did was testing things a lot in production like database in a staging environment. So I, re-encrypted everything multiple times. With our QA team, BaseCamp tested things while encryption was going on for trying to detect issues. The process where your account is not encrypted, and after a few hours, everything is encrypted. What happens during that period? I was really concerned about that part of the equation. But in general, it was nerve wracking because this technology was ours. So it's not like it wasn't battle tested, let's say, but we didn't run into major issues through all the history. In the first deploy, we had a problem with emails. So in MySQL, which is the database we use in the coalition we have configured, it's case insensitive. So it doesn't really matter whether things are upcase or downcase. And we lost that when we encrypted. And I realized after encrypting, and that's a problem for email because email is also case insensitive. So someone can type your email with upcase. So, but quickly realized after shipping about the problem, and it was, I think it was, I quickly added this option downcase for encrypted attributes. So you can use downcase, and the information is going to be downcased automatically for deterministic encryption. But yeah, I think that I remember that incident when we released the first version. But yeah, in general, it's like everything. So now these days, I'm working on adding encryption to BC4, and again, I'm way calmer than I was with Hey because now it's battle tested the technology, but still, it's not something I take lightly. It's not something I say, wow, it's something I intend to test thoroughly over and over before shipping anything. Because with encryption, by definition, if you encrypt something and you can't decrypt it, for example, for some reason, that equals to losing data. So it's as serious as that.
I think that's called hashing.
Yeah, exactly.
one way.
Exactly.
Hey folks, it's Charles Max Wood, and I just wanted to jump in here and let you know about something that I'm doing. It's free. It's out there just to help you get answers to your questions about the things that you're running into with your career. So if you have questions about how to get further ahead in your career, how to start a podcast, how to get a better job, how to get a raise, how to deal with a situation at work with your boss, or just maybe you're stuck and you don't know where to go next. How do I get from junior to senior to whatever's next? How do I become a speaker? How do I get to the next level? That's what I'm out here to do. So every Wednesday at 12 o'clock Mountain Time, I'm going to be doing a call, and it's going to be free, totally free. Go to devchat.tv/levelup, and you can register for the call. It's using Zoom's webinar software, so it's pretty straightforward. And what we're going to be doing is I'll do 10 minutes, and I'll just show you how I do some form of how I level up, and then we'll just answer questions. And it's not going to be a question and answer like, hey, what's your favorite flavor of ice cream? And then I say Rocky Road or whatever, right? Instead, what we're looking for is more along the lines of, yeah, I have this situation. How do I handle it? I'm trying to figure this thing out. How do I figure it out? I'm trying to stay current. How do I stay current? And if you have any of those kinds of questions, I'll bring you on the call. We'll ask some deeper questions. We'll make sure we get you a solid answer. And I'm really looking forward to helping some people out. There will be no sales, no selling, no nothing on these calls. It is literally just 10 minutes of training and then Q&A. So you can go check it out at devchat.tv/levelup.
Having used Adder Encrypted like multiple times, when I read your article, I was thinking about the fact. So I've never ended up having to do this before, but there, I guess, was a problem in Adder Encrypted 2 or something like that or whatever. Anyway, there's a strategy that's like down at the bottom of Adder Encrypted where they talk about migrating data from like an old version to a new version, and like they offer like a couple, they don't implement any of them, but they offer a couple strategies for you to try, including one where you basically like store what method you use to encrypt the data in your database and use that sort of to help it figure out what to do to get it out. But yeah, hairy stuff. I've never had to do that, and I'm happy that I've never had to do that.
Having encryption like this in Rails, I don't think people realize how significant it is, right? Like you mentioned, Adder Encrypted, that is definitely a standard I've used before, that library. I know Lockbox has come out recently that looks actually very similar to the existing Active Record API. So people using that will definitely feel familiar. But I mean, encryption in general is a really hard problem, like you mentioned, Jorge, where it's very easy to get wrong. And like you said, when you guys were ready to release, an expert came and said, hey, like, you can't do this. Who's to know, like, unless you do that encryption all the time, right? So I understand why Ruby is kind of hesitant to create some kind of security class or similar because of that, because there would have to be buy-in from a security expert, right, to maintain these kinds of things. So I'm kind of curious to know, I guess, how you came about creating this library over using one of the existing tool sets, and where you think Ruby in general lays with OpenSSL, the state of that, as far as a safe mechanism to tie into.
Yeah, so for the first question, I a lot of existing libraries in Rails and learned a lot from them. The reason for creating our own was both related to features. So, for example, what I was mentioning about what happens when you have to encrypt information and you have information that is not encrypted and information that is encrypted, but you want queries to keep working. That was a scenario that it wasn't theoretical for us. It was what we had to do in Hey. We had a situation. So, for example, that no library covered that. There was also the matter of, let's say, internal design of the libraries. I didn't find a library where I would be like 100% convinced of adopting right away in the way things were designed for making the kind of features I wanted to add or the extensions I wanted to add. This technology was going to be like core to BaseCamp. So there was also the fact that we kind of, all things considered, owning the technology and the expertise, the technology was another factor for us. That's true. But yeah, and also if you check now, all the features. So first of all, the first day I started working on this, I couldn't envision all the features we were going to have to support. But even the ones I had in mind, where I couldn't find them in the existing libraries. So that was the reason. But now in hindsight, with all the things that we have added and all the things that I've had to do, I'm really glad that we made that decision. So, for example, this encryption scheme changes. The very notion of encryption scheme is something that I added an encryption scheme to Active Record Encryption after creating the Rails pull request. So I was always talking about active encryption schemes, but there was no this in the code for an encryption scheme, and now there is. All these features that we've used over and over, I don't know how they would have looked in an existing library, because they are like core, they are like very delicate, and I think it will the path of reusing an existing library eventually would have presented more frictions for the things we wanted to do. That's the answer for the first question. And regarding Ruby, so yeah, Ruby supports OpenSSL. OpenSSL is a C library, and there are some standard wrappers in Ruby. It's not super easy to use. It's kind of low level, but it works super fast and it's super robust. So I'm not sure if Ruby is going to embrace some higher level approach to security. If Rails or Ruby Rails already offers some kind of this class, I think it's called Encryptor, implements a cipher. I think it's Encryptor, that it wraps AES 256 so that you can encrypt information very easily with symmetric encryption. So Rails already offers some kind of high-level encryption utilities. Ruby, I'm not sure if they have plans to do that. But if you want to use OpenSSL directly, it's pretty kind of rough for sure.
Yeah, I've definitely gone to encrypt, streams or just data in general in Ruby, and had a very hard time working through OpenSSL for sure. So I've definitely gone and just required some Rails helpers at times to just ease the process of that. So my next question to follow up is, do you have any plans to kind of upstream some of this stuff to Ruby, like say in my personal, I may not even do this now, but my next hack day, I was going to plan to encrypt IRB session history. But with the console 1984, it almost seems pointless. Because you can just use the console and get a bunch of extra features on top of that, right?
So to be honest, it wasn't in my radar. I think that contributing things to IRB, I don't know if the project maintainers will be up to this. So I think that the console 1984 works at a very high level of abstraction. It requires active record encryption. It requires, active record in the first place because it is recording things in the database, managing those audit trails as active record models. So I don't think Ruby without Rails would be a good fit for this stuff. I don't think so. Maybe Ruby could present like some nicer abstractions for encrypting things. That I agree, or I think that's a good idea.
You said earlier that that you added on that database component later. Is it possible to run console 1984 without the database component?
Well, yeah, actually, not out of the box, but it's easy to configure. So in the first version of console 1984, the one that we ran for 1 year and a half, actually, it was those audit trails were just JSON logs that we were piping into our logging pipeline for Hey. So the database, those logs ended up consumed by or exploited by Kibana, which was the software we were using. We created a dashboard in Kibana for auditing those logs, which was nice, but also very manual and cumbersome to use. So, but it's possible in the sense that there is a configuration option, something audits logger or something like that. I mean, I don't even remember, but if you go to the console 1984 README, I think there is a configuration option for configuring the object that persists those commands. So the default implementation stores those audit trails in the database, but you could do whatever you want if you implemented your own. So there is a piece you need to override for customizing how to consume those audit trails.
Yeah, so it looks like, so the database doesn't seem to be an issue, but if I presume the active record encryption, which it depends on active record. So fair enough. It would be interesting to get all that power into Ruby. Go ahead, Valentino.
I was going to say, just kind of following off the tails of this console 1984 is the auditing, which I don't know if we've mentioned it, but is another gem, auditing or audit 1984, which on its own, if anybody has ever used the audited gem, I'm sure you've built a interface to try and make sense of all the auditing logs in some UI capacity. And what I found really awesome about it is that it includes that as part of the gem and gives you a nice mountable engine so you can see that full audit trail from, an authenticated endpoint pretty easily. I was playing with that this morning. It is very slick.
Yeah, there's another gem out there. Trying to remember what it is called, but that's the one that I've been using for the past few years, specifically because it handles the view side better.
You think of Paper Trail?
Not Paper Trail. Hang on, I'm literally trying to pull it up like right now in a gem file. I just can't remember off the top of my head. It's done by the guys that have like the hat on there as their thing. Come on, where is it? This is a short gem file. I should be able to find it. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna cry here. Public activity. There it is. I'll find the link, but it's called Public Activity. And it honestly, to be honest, Paper Trail and Audited and Public Activity, they're all more or less very similar concepts, though they all have different angles. Paper Trail's hey, we're going to store the serialized version of the object, and Audited's we're going to save the changes or whatever. I believe Public Activity saves changes too, but the thing that I cared about was that they made it super easy for me to make that page. I'm disappointed that it's not as popular.
I didn't know it, but it looks pretty cool.
Yeah, it's I have a very new version of Rails on this one project, and I've run into a couple problems that were hairy, and I was oh crud, I'm gonna have to start going back to Paper Trail or something next time.
So are there plans to create a 1984 logger so that we can then fill? I know we have the already the kind of protected logging. It'll swap out certain fields in the database or in the database logs, right? Is there a more
Valentino,
restrictive logger planned where it'll only allow specific set rules?
Valentino, I was going to say the 1984 logger is actually already running on your machine. You just don't know that it is. Sorry, go ahead.
No, sure. So no, there are no plans to do that. But sounds like an interesting idea, to be honest. So in terms of future features for console 1984, Well, in the coming months, I would like to continue working on the anti-tampering mechanisms as people report problems or things. Oh, hey, if I do that, I can do bad things. So I love fixing those. And then probably we will give some love to audits 1984. It's pretty in a pretty basic shape right now. I mean, it's super functional and it's so much better than what we used to use until not so long ago. But it's probably too simple. There are a bunch of things we can do there. But I mean, the stuff is open source, Valentino. So if you have an idea, what you mentioned looks super interesting. So if you want to take a stab.
Sounds like MERB 1984 when we allow customizations to it.
Yeah, I just think when you start like sending data off to vendors as an example, you start to realize, maybe there's some things I shouldn't be sending off in the logs just as an example. But I think this is a really good foundation for going forward to add kind of some of these other suspicious commands as an example, as you've outlined in the console 1984.
I wanted to say that Active Record Encryption has this feature so that when you declare encrypted attributes under the hood, it extends this action dispatch system for blinding parameters in logs. So, for example, if you encrypt a field named email address, whenever you see an email address as the param of some controller action in your logs, it's going to be blinded. So it's kind of rough in the sense that it's just a list of names that is going to encrypt, but it's already pretty powerful. So for us, it works pretty well because for free, I mean, it's a configuration option that you can enable or disable. I'm not sure if it's enabled by default, but when you enable it, you get a lot of sensitive data blending for free. So yeah, it's not what you said exactly, but it kind of goes in that line.
Yeah, I'm interested to see what more kind of filters will come out of this as well as people start to play with it and use it in production systems. I imagine it a lot like, a Signal Sciences kind of reaction where people start to be a little more, proactive about this kind of stuff.
Yeah,
that's good.
That's a great point. Yeah. So to me, if you ask me about the ultimate benefit of using Active Record Encryption is that you are capturing what's sensitive information at the code level. So that means it's formally captured. It's something you can act on. You can build tooling around it. And to me, that's like the great benefit of the whole thing. That now, instead of sensitive information, instead of being something that lives in the abstract, it lives in your application. So you can do things with that. And I think that's super powerful. And I hope to see more cool things, in the future based on this.
Yeah, I have definitely seen a lot more conversation on encryption in the past few years than I did, in the previous 10 years of Rails life. I'm not saying that no one ever talked about it previously, but I feel like with maturity of the product has come people using it and just expecting it to have these things ready-made for them. And they're like, well, Rails sucks because it doesn't automatically handle all these things for me that are really hard. And I feel like people have just been making a lot of complaints about those over the past few years. And I think it's awesome to see what appears to be everything that I've read in the past week on this. I'm just holy cow, I really wish this existed 5 years ago, because it's this holistic looking approach, right? That, to be frank, I kind of expect out of almost everything that BaseCamp gives us. So thank you, BaseCamp. But yeah, I it's very holistic. It's very rounded. It might have some rough edges or some things that I don't like, but who cares? Whatever. It's still way better than me having to make all of it myself, right? And that's amazing and awesome. I think that, as we said earlier, from my perspective, we've just leveled up the console here, right? For any project where you have sensitive data, sure, whatever, the malicious programmer can get to stuff, but we just level it up to make it harder for that person. And we've also just by default, made it so that the person just troubleshooting stuff doesn't magically see stuff they weren't intending to see, at least without actually digging in. So I think that's awesome. And I mean, I've used Adder Encrypted over the years, have had no real problems with it, but at the same time, it's nice to see a new version and iteration. I know I'll be trying it out for sure, because Adder Encrypted has known problems, and I want to try out and see if this peanut butter tastes better. Let's be frank.
For those listening,
I don't know why I use peanut butter. I hate peanut butter. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that the Adder Encrypted library is is looking for maintainers. So if that is something that you are looking to help support, they're actively searching. So either take a look at that or take a look at the active record encryption.
To be honest, the fact that libraries like ATTR encryption, there was also another gem which is called symmetric encryption, which is less known that and ATTR encrypted. Symmetric encryption and Logbox, which is also famous, but symmetric encryption, for example, was a big source of inspiration for me. So yeah, I really appreciate the work that people did with those libraries, because also when you are the first one doing something, it's like it's way harder. So I could really, what I did, I could build it on what they did in many ways, because they validated the idea, they explored different ways of implementing the same. So different libraries use completely different approaches, so you can check what works and what doesn't, and that's priceless. So yeah, I really appreciate the work that the community did with those libraries, and the author of those libraries did, and it was key for what I did, to make that clear.
Absolutely. And many of the problems, right, that have come up over the years have been solved, or have solutions for to reference. And yeah, I mean, we always stand on the shoulders of people before us, right?
So real quick, Jorge, can you kind of shed some light on what future plans are for the active record encryption, and kind of what some challenges are that you face in the near term?
So yeah, so what I have in mind, what I said about Console 1984, I would like to keep. If people report security issues of some kind, I'm going to work on that, because it's important to me. I want to keep the gem simple to install, but maybe I'm willing to make it internally more complex and more sophisticated, as there are more things we need to handle in terms of making the gem secure. That's one thing I'm going to tackle for sure. In terms of active record encryption, one area that I would like to attack at some point is sorting. So sorting encrypted data, you can't sort encrypted data. Essentially, it's something that it's not solved. You can do that if you load everything in memory, which is never an option, but not with a query, not at the database level. So there are like research papers about encryption algorithms that keep sorting properties, but they are like super experimental, nothing that looks like super appealing. There is something that I would like to explore, which is leveraging the encryption that databases engines provide. So, for example, with MySQL or with Postgres, you can use encryption functions when you are querying data. So when you are querying a column, you can pass an AES encryption function with some key, and it's going to read that data decrypted or encrypted when you are writing it. So and queries work if you use that, and sorting works if you use that. So that's something I would like to explore, but I'm not sure if it's going to be possible to solve. But it's an interesting, and I think it's very worth to try to solve that problem, because sorting encrypted data is a real need. It's something that applications need to do, and right now it's not solved. So if some of you or anyone listening want to take a stab at that, it will be a wonderful contribution to the project.
That actually reminds me of one thing. So I know I put the link in here, and I'll make sure that it ends up in our list of links. It goes in the show notes, but I don't know if there's a better place, but I know that Adder Encrypted at the very end of its README has like a section that lists like some caveats that you have to be aware of whenever you're encrypting stuff. Some of them include some of the stuff that we've said today, which is like searching, requires, if you have basically a whatever the initialization value, or they just call it IV in Adder Encrypted. So if you have an IV for each individual record and it's not deterministic or whatever, then you can't search or whatever. So you have to choose a lesser encryption, right? If you want to do searching or joining, things like that. There's also like a few other things in there. You have to consider whether or not if the encrypted value is going to be too long for your field, right? Like you have to pay attention to that, because you can get truncated if you're not careful. So it brings up a few things that you have to pay attention to. So we'll link it. So if you haven't encrypted before, you should definitely be aware of and look into these things. I hadn't even really actually thought of the sorting one. I didn't really think of it because in most cases I was like, well, if I want to search anyway, I have to do some janky stuff. So for the most part, I have avoided using encryption on things that were searchable for that reason. But yeah, I don't know if you guys have any more thoughts, but like I'll try and link that for some caveats. I don't know if there's better articles that have even more or not.
Now that you're mentioning it, we should probably write a section about caveats in the active record encryption guide, because that's as you were like enumerating the things, I was saying, oh, we should add that, like ATTR encrypted. Yeah,
it's always good to. I mean, people, you don't think about these things until you like run into the problem, and as we've said before, like if you have a problem with encryption, it's pretty destructive. Like there's no going back.
Yeah, totally.
You just lost that data.
One thing I've seen, and we've seen BaseCamp with Console 1984 and with this approach to encrypt data, personal data, is that once you get used to use a console like this, when you go back to other application that is not using Console 1984, it feels really weird. So I think it's a technology that as people adopt it, as you get used to it, then you miss it if you don't have it, because most people I know want to use things responsibly. Not you don't open a Rails console to do evil things. So this level of protection that Rails console Console 1984 adds is I think it's really appreciated, and you get used to it very quickly, and then it feels weird if it's not there. So yeah, I encourage people to give it a try, and with encryption, I'd say that there are for sure things to have in mind, but in the general case of if you have fields that you want to query, encrypting them deterministically is like a line in your active record model, and that's it. And you can use queries and they are going to work, and you don't really have to care much. So in all the gems we've released, I think that I have made a huge effort on offering, default paths that are very simple for most users. That's kind of an obsession I have. So that if you want to use Console 1984, just install the gem and run the migrations, and you are set. With active record encryption, it's pretty much the same. You can run a reg task to generate your keys, add them to your credentials file, and you are set to go. You can use it. You can start using encrypts with your attribute names, and you essentially have to care about encrypts and encrypts with deterministic true, and everything should work. So yeah, I encourage people to give it a try, because I think it's the kind of thing that after a few years using it, you say, oh, so a few years ago I could open a Rails console and explore my database freely and access to any message or any name or any contact that I wanted. Was that a thing? I think that it's that powerful. The change is that powerful.
Yeah, one thing I thought that was really impressive too is that the serialization even works before and after decrypting. I was playing with that, and I was pretty impressed that was there intact. I had a JSON column that it just worked with.
Yeah, the thing is that Active Record has a pretty rich internal model for attributes, and I think it's inherited from Active Model. So, and it's incredibly rich and complex, and it's something you never see when you are using Active Record. But it was a pleasure, like extending things, because everything has like its place, and it's really well designed. So, because Active Record encryption is implemented as an active record type, is a kind of type. It plays well with other types because the system allows you to do that. So yeah, that's definitely because of the way Active Record is designed, which is very well designed.
Thank you, Attributes API.
It's always nice. You get that feeling of a good design when you're working with something, right? Because it just makes you feel good extending and using it.
Yeah, totally. Active Record is like, if you check the code, it's such a beast. It's huge. There are so many classes, so many things moving on. And I'm not sure how many experts are in the internals of Active Record. But there is a part for another part I would like to improve is the system we use for extending Active Record queries, so that we can modify them on the fly and inject the values we want. So, for example, what I was saying about querying encrypted and unencrypted data at the same time, we do that under the hood. But the way we do that is kind of very rudimentary, I think. It's not leveraging the Active Record internals in the way it should. It's like kind of, well, I found a way of making it work, but it doesn't feel like right or the best way to do it. So that's another thing I would like to improve if I have the time in the future. But yeah, I would like to spend some good time studying Active Record internals, because they are like an operating system or something like that. Is huge.
Understandable. Did you want to talk about anything else, or anybody else have any questions before we move on into picks?
Oh,
I'll take that as a no. All right,
no,
sweet.
I'm good.
So let's go ahead and move on to picks.
Hey, folks, if you love this podcast and would like to support the show, or if you wish you could listen without the sponsorship messages, then you're in luck. We're setting up new premium podcast feeds where you can get all of the episodes released after Christmas 2020 without the ads. Signing up will help us pay for editing and production, and you can go sign up at devchat.tv/premium.
Darren, do you want to open us up?
Sure. I have 2 picks today. Both are kind of short reads. They're articles. The first is by Noel Rabin, and it's titled More Ruby Magic, but I like it for 2 reasons. One, it talks about making time easier. The gist of it is adding methods such as one business day ago, for example. And the approach that he takes is by deconstructing those tokens. And so that it's actually, we talked about metaprogramming in a previous episode. I think it's an example of responsible metaprogramming, where it deconstructs the tokens and kind of then comes up with, okay, well, what are the actual date calculations I need to do? So it's a short but interesting read. Time is always just a challenging thing to work with, especially if you have time series data. And then the other short read is an interview with James Gosling, the creator of Java. It's published in DZone. The interviewer, Grigory Petrov, it's almost more in the entertainment category. So the interviewer kind of prompts James on a number of occasions about Ruby and modern language features. James Gosling seems fairly happy with the choices that were made. He prefers statically typed languages, objects, classes, etc. But it's kind of interesting to see how the interview goes, and how often Ruby is mentioned in that interview. So it's another interesting short read. Those are my picks.
Awesome. Thanks. Valentino, did you have any for today?
Yeah, I got a couple here. First one is a presentation by Isabelle Lafont. She gave on MJML, which is a new kind of email templating engine for Ruby that makes it really easy to put together dynamically designed emails that are responsive. They work on mobile, desktop, and it's a pretty cool library. So definitely check that out. Another one is Ben Ornstein. I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but he's the owner of Tuple. He just tweeted out that he's going to give away lifetime accounts to any open source maintainers. So I definitely would recommend checking out the form that he provided on his tweet. I'll leave a note to that. And another one, I came across a PyRC file on a Reddit, in one of the Ruby Reddits, and it lets you just quickly see the runtime or process time for any executed IRB command that you're running, which is pretty cool. We'll just show it right in your little command prompt. So I'll place the link to that as well.
Nice. I'm excited as a fanatical Pry user myself. All right. So I have 2 picks for today. So first one that I want to pick is I may have picked this a very long time ago, but if so, I'm just picking it again because it has recently made my life so much better, and that's Calendly, and people might be familiar with it, but man, having like a scheduling system that you can just send somebody a link to, and it puts my multiple calendars together for me without me having to do anything is pretty amazing. Prior to this, I definitely had a lot more rescheduling, that would happen when people would schedule something, and I would just, either just derp and look at my calendar and not see something that was there, or, just not check all my calendars because I was just, in a rush or something, and be like, oh yeah, that sounds great, or whatever, let's do it, and then I need to reschedule. It's really nice to just be able to send somebody a link, and Calendly is It's a computer program. It doesn't make those kinds of mistakes. It's great. So for somebody that like is kind of busy and it just needs to schedule stuff and needs it to work, Calendly has been amazing. So that's that. The other thing is, I mean, I know that we've been talking about encryption stuff today, and I brought up a couple libraries. So, I mean, definitely check out Encrypted if it's something that interests you. But I definitely was going to put in a plug for public activity or whatever that we mentioned earlier. For auditing or whatever, both because I don't know. So this is sort of, from my perspective, I kind of feel like all of the auditing libraries have aspects that I don't like about them, and I don't know if that's a fundamental problem of auditing in general, but I definitely feel like I don't know. Part of the major reason why I like public activity, as I said earlier, I think it does a really good job of creating that page where you can view everything, or it exposes the functionality such that it's super easy to create that. But number two, like I prefer the style of library where you store changes rather than trying to store the entire object. I find that Papertrail, even though it is like the more common library, has some severe hiccups because reifying an object that's very old is not really all that realistic. You have to do a ton of work to make that work in most cases. And so what I always find myself doing with Papertrail is I actually have like an adapter that goes through all of the Papertrail objects and converts it to changes in order to actually do things. So I've done that on like almost every project that I've used it. I do have a preference for that type. So I use the audited / public activity style, which is to just grab changes, but I think audited's super old. So there's opportunity to create a new library here, or you should check out public activity, which I think is cool. So yeah, I'll leave that there. Jorge, did you have any picks for us possibly?
Yeah, sure. So one is Truffle Ruby. I've been playing with it in recent times for some personal project where I wanted to interact with a Java library. And in the past, I've used JRuby, which is fantastic for these things. But the problem with JRuby is the startup time, which is, it's not JRuby is related, it's the way the Java virtual machine starts. You get like a few seconds, like 5-6 seconds on every run, which is when you are, for example, running tests or something, it's annoying because the feedback loop is kind of slow. Truffle Ruby has these two ways of working. One they call it native, and the other one they call it JVM. And the native mode, that's a flag that you pass to the Ruby interpreter. And in the native mode is super fast to start. It won't interact with Java, but it's as fast as the Ruby implementation, the MRI. And in the JVM mode, it's you can interact with Java. It's a little bit slower to start than JRuby, but I like it, like having both modes in the same project, so that when you are not doing anything Java related, you get like the speed. But when you want to do something with Java, for example, when you launch the service or whatever, it works seamlessly. So whenever I see these things of languages interacting, JRuby already looked like magic to me, like sorcery, and this is pretty amazing technology. That's my first pick. My second pick is this parser gem I mentioned. I can paste the link. I found this recently when working on the Console 1984 library. I wanted to collect the constants or collect assignments, for example, in the console, or analyze Ruby code, and it's super easy to use. You get you pass it a chunk of code, you get the AST, then you can implement like a visitor that where you overwrite the methods you want for the things you want to analyze, and it worked perfectly fine for doing something that is quite complex. So I quite enjoyed it. And my last pick will be Nintendo Switch, which is something I've discovered recently. I know I'm late to the party, but I have two daughters, and I'm playing with my older daughter quite a bit. Recently, we played Zelda Breath of the Wild, which is absolutely fantastic. We're playing Mario Odyssey these days, and for some reason I stopped playing video games for a bunch of years. I don't know why, but now I'm kind of doing it again, and I'm kind of old to everything because people now are working to other things, to play into other things. But yeah, I totally recommend the Switch. And that's those three from me.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Jorge. If people wanted to find out more about you, follow you, things like that, where would they go?
Sure. So, I have a personal page, jorgemanrubia.com. My GitHub handle is Jorge Manrubia, without any separation. And yeah, I also have a Twitter, Jorge Manru in this case. But I think my personal page is a good place to go if you want to learn more about me or contact me or whatever.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming and chatting with us and teaching us more about encryption, as well as letting us know about all the work that you've been putting in. So thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a pleasure. I had fun. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, take care, everybody. That's it for Ruby Rogues this week. We'll see you next time.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.